Here we're going to be looking at the question of peace and reconciliation in Cambodia. For one element of this post, you could pick one of the following terms and define it: genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. These are three terms. They should be three different threads. If somebody has already defined one of these terms, please reply to them directly to keep the threads intact. The Herero genocide from 1907 had ideas, methods, and a lexicon that Nazi leaders borrowed from and expanded upon. The Armenian genocide from 1915 to 1923 is important because Turkey still refuses to acknowledge that the events of this genocide took place. As the historian Robert Proctor explains, for Nazi physicians, no sharp line divided the destruction of racially inferior and the mentally or physically defective in the case of the Nazi genocide of the disabled. In the case of the Cotton Forest Massacre of 1940, that all but one of the Cotton victims was male makes the massacre important when thinking about the relationship of gender to genocide. In the Indonesian genocide, there is a pattern of targeting Chinese in four areas where the genocide was most violent: Java, Sumatra, Borneo, and Bali. In the Cambodian genocide, it's extremely similar to the Indonesian genocide in that politics are, in fact, the surface issue only. There's sort of deeper conflict in the Cambodian case. In the case of the Rwandan genocide, in 1994, we have a somewhat unique case because this ended with a revolution and one of the first major genocide trials of 1994. It is therefore to these genocide trials that people are looking at as a point of sort of guidance for the case of Cambodia. Like the case of Guatemala, in the case of Cambodia, the legitimacy of government leaders and their closeness with former military organizations is important. The appointment of Nay Tol, who's pictured here at the center of the slide, an army general with a record of denying human rights to defendants, delegitimized the bench of the extraordinary chambers of the courts of Cambodia over the course of its early days. Nonetheless, his appointment was very clear in terms of its motivation. He would protect the allies of Hun Sen, who remains in power in the country. Key Tek, who is pictured at the right-hand side of the slide, is the president of the Cambodian Bar Association. He threatened reprisals for local lawyers working with the extraordinary chambers of the courts of Cambodia and tried to stamp out any form of foreign participation as essentially a colonialist venture, criticizing French and American participation, perhaps rightly, but also playing upon this to stamp out local participation as well. The idea that the trials will allow Cambodian society to heal seems relatively unrealistic. Most Cambodians probably will not benefit from these trials. Furthermore, there are political motives. Hun Sen requested to add a defeated political opponent, a royal who was affiliated with the Royalist Khmer Rouge alliance against Hun Sen's Vietnamese-backed government in the 1990s and 1980s, to the docket. But this royal was never a member of the Khmer Rouge and never participated in any of the crimes. Right after his 1997 demi-coup that brought him to power and then nominally elected him shortly thereafter in the 1998 elections, he again manipulated the court's records by attempting to push other members into the limelight, so to speak, to have them put to trial as well. These requests were denied, but they further delegitimized the extraordinary chambers of the courts of Cambodia in the public perception, in the public eye. Still, Hun Sen uses the ECCC to distract from other human rights issues or claims of his increasing authoritarianism in Cambodia, and has done so since the origins of the court. The First impact was that the trials brought in millions in foreign attention and investment from the People's Republic of China, Japan, and especially the United States and France. The second impact was that the trials blamed only a few and exonerated many others implicitly. Therefore, there is a question of who is to blame brought up again. The third impact was that there is a maintenance of a populist approach through the position of the trial. The argument is most Cambodians want a trial, but the question is, do they? We are not sure. For your post, consider the implications of peace in Cambodia and compare it to Guatemala, and then note any similarities or differences, and let's get the discussion going. What can be gleaned from the comparative study of Cambodia and also Guatemala and Rwanda, for example? Reading through the assessments of several historians, such as Margolis in 2007 and Cook in 1997, there's a question of historical memory. Most of the population in Cambodia is born after the Khmer Rouge, and most of the population can't really explain what happened because high school history books ignore the period. Most of the population of the United States cannot explain that the American government backed the Khmer Rouge in the 1980s simply because they were fighting with the People's Army of Vietnam. Looking backward in 2010s, historians have begun working on improving teaching in Cambodia, most notably Dr. Vong Sotoria and Sombo Manara, among others, were improving education in the country. But we have to think about these various comparisons. Writing about the after of Rwanda, where there was an estimated 1 million deaths, and Burundi and Zaire also remained impacted. At the UN tribunals in Arusha, Tanzania, there were very few arrests, and these trials were regarded not as significant in terms of the international community. The judiciary system in Rwanda was utterly destroyed, but the trials in Arusha were not enough. Lack of individual accountability created Hutu-Tutsi ethnic tensions that re-emerged as a perpetrator-victim or revenge-seeker frame was perpetuated. The DK regime, which became Pol Pot's army in the 1980s, was essentially still fighting with the central government in the Cambodian case. The U.S. Congress passed, however, the Cambodian Justice Act in 1994 during the Clinton administration, marking a turn in American policy after advocacy of the campaign to oppose the return of the Khmer Rouge was headed by historian Ben Kiernan, and Ben Kiernan directed the Cambodian Genocide Program under a 2-year mandate to create a massive series of congressional reports. Data from this particular research put into 4 structures: a bibliographic database, a biographic database of perpetrators and victims and survivors, a geographic database of Cambodia, and an imaging database that collected all this information on the crimes. The question for you that you might comment on, if the earlier prompt was not enough, is how would you consider the organization of these historical databases beneficial? What information goes into each and why? Is it notable that commissioning the works of historians to cover the period could be a benefit? The theory of the benefits is noted by Cook as well as by Margolis, but we might be able to brainstorm about this as well. So if you want to create a quick post about that as an alternative, go ahead and do that, and then we'll move on.